This presentation details a major true crime event. Viewer discretion is advised. They came dressed as cops. It was 1:24 a.m. on a cold Boston morning. The city still buzzing from St. Patrick's Day celebrations. Two men in police uniforms rang the bell at the employee entrance of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum. Inside, the night watchman, a 23-year-old kid named Rick Abath, saw them on the security monitor. They told him they were investigating a disturbance. They had a warrant. It was a lie. But it was a lie that would cost the world $500 million. This is the story of the single biggest property theft in history. 13 masterpieces, including a priceless Vermeer and 3 Rembrandts, ripped from their frames and vanished into the night. It's a crime that decades later remains utterly unsolved. There have been no arrests, no ransom notes, no credible sightings of the art. The FBI has chased leads from Boston's mob underworld to the IRA in Ireland, from quiet Connecticut suburbs to the high-stakes art markets of Japan. And they have found nothing. Absolutely nothing. The empty frames still hang on the museum walls, a constant haunting reminder of what was lost. They are ghosts of a perfect crime. And they beg the question that has baffled investigators for over 30 years. How did two men with seemingly no special skills bypass a modern security system, steal a fortune, and simply disappear from the face of the earth? To understand the crime, you first have to understand the place. Because the Gardner is not like any other museum in the world. It wasn't built by a committee or a city council. It was the private obsession of one woman, Isabella Stewart Gardner. And she was a force of nature. Born into New York high society in 1840, Mrs. Jack, as she was known, was a rebel from the start. She smoked in public, walked a pet lion down the street, and wore a headband that proclaimed, "Oh, you Red Sox," to symphony concerts. She was brilliant, eccentric, and fantastically wealthy. When her only son died tragically, she and her husband, Jack, began traveling the world, and Isabella found a new purpose: collecting art. Not just art, but the very soul of history. She didn't just buy paintings, she bought entire rooms. Gothic archways, Renaissance choir stalls, Roman mosaics. She shipped them back to Boston and in 1903, opened her museum. But she didn't want a sterile gallery. She wanted a home. A Venetian palace in the middle of New England, where priceless masterpieces hung next to simple furniture, where natural light streamed through a stunning central courtyard, and every single object was placed according to her specific artistic vision. It was her masterpiece, and she was fiercely protective of it. So protective, in fact, that her last will and testament contained a clause that is both the museum's greatest charm and its most tragic curse. The will stipulates that if any major changes are ever made to her collection, if anything is moved, sold, or rearranged from how she left it, the entire collection, every last painting, sculpture, and tapestry, must be auctioned off in Paris, and the proceeds given to Harvard University. The museum itself would be dissolved, its essence scattered to the winds. This is why, to this day, you can walk into the Gardner's Dutch room and see those empty gilded frames. They cannot be moved. They hang there as a testament to her will, and as a tombstone for the art that was stolen. It was a violation not just of a museum, but of a person's soul. The night it happened was March 18, 1990. Boston was a mess. St. Patrick's Day had fallen on a Saturday, and the entire city was a sea of green noise and drunken revelry. The streets were packed, the police were overwhelmed. It was the perfect night to be invisible. Inside the Gardner Museum, the party was over. The last of the staff had gone home. The security of this priceless, irreplaceable collection was left in the hands of two young night watchmen. One of them was Rick Abath. He was 23 years old, a rock musician in a band called Ukiah. The museum job was just that, a job. It paid the bills while he pursued his real passion. He was known for being a bit of a slacker, sometimes showing up for his shift high, or letting friends wander through the galleries after hours. He wasn't a security professional. He was a kid in a uniform. His partner that night was 25-year-old Randy Heston, a newer guard on only his third night shift at the Gardner. Two young men with minimal training, guarding a $500 million treasure. The museum's security system, while modern for its time, had flaws. There was no direct video recording. The cameras fed to a VCR that had to be manually changed. The only direct link to the police was a single panic button, located at the main security desk. If a guard could be lured away from that desk, they were effectively on their own. The thieves knew this. At 12:54 a.m., just 20 minutes before the fake police would arrive, the fire alarms went off. Abath at the desk saw on his panel that the alarm was triggered in two separate rooms, far apart from each other. This was strange. A real fire would likely trigger adjacent alarms. He suspected a malfunction. He silenced the first alarm, then did a quick patrol. Finding nothing, he returned to the desk and silenced the second. He didn't call the fire department. He didn't call the head of security. He assumed it was a glitch. But some investigators now believe this was a test. The thieves watching from outside were testing the response, seeing how the guard would react. And what they saw was a young man who didn't follow protocol, who took a shortcut. They saw their opening. 30 minutes later, at 1:24 a.m., the buzzer for the side entrance rang. Abath looked at the monitor. He saw two men in what looked like authentic Boston police uniforms. They had hats, badges, jackets. One had a thick, bushy mustache. They were standing under a blue police light, which made them look even more official. They motioned for him to come to the door, breaking one of the museum's most fundamental rules: never open the door for anyone, no matter who they claim to be. Abath opened it. The man with the mustache spoke first. He said they'd received a report of a disturbance in the courtyard. He said they needed to come inside. Abath was hesitant. He knew the rules. But these were cops. You don't argue with the police. He let them into the small vestibule between the outer and inner doors. He let them in, but he didn't buzz them through the second door into the museum itself. He was still following at least part of the procedure. Through the glass, the officers told him he looked familiar. They asked if there was a warrant out for his arrest. It was an odd question, but it worked. It flustered him. It made him want to be cooperative. They ordered him to step out from behind the security desk to prove his identity. This was the critical moment. The desk was his fortress. It held the logbooks, the phone, and most importantly, the single red panic button that would have brought the Real Boston police crashing through the doors in minutes. By stepping away from it, he was surrendering the entire museum. He walked out from behind the desk. The thieves had him. One of them looked at him and said, "You're not going to get in trouble. We know you're not the one we're looking for. Just call your partner down here." Abath complied. He radioed up to Randy Heston, who was on patrol, and told him to come down to the security station. When Heston arrived, the trap was sprung. The man with the mustache looked at both guards. His tone changed. The pretense of police work vanished. He told them to face the wall. He said, "Gentlemen, this is a robbery." He pushed Abath against an electrical panel and swiftly handcuffed him. As the cold metal clicked shut around his wrists, Abath felt a surge of disbelief. He blurted out, "But you're not supposed to handcuff me to this. You could fry the whole system." The thief just looked at him and replied, "You're not supposed to be cuffed to the panel. You're supposed to be arrested." Then they took out the duct tape. They taped Abath's hands, feet, and mouth. They did the same to Heston. The two guards, the only line of defense for $500 million in art, were now completely helpless, lying on the floor of their own museum. The thieves had total control. And for the next 81 minutes, they would wander the silent halls of Isabella Stewart Gardner's palace and commit the biggest art heist the world has ever seen. With the guards bound and gagged, the two men had the run of the place. The entire museum, a 4-story Venetian palace packed with $1 billion worth of priceless treasures, was theirs. The motion detectors that lined the hallways had been triggered the moment they stepped away from the security desk. But that didn't matter. The guards couldn't call for help, and the alarms only registered on a panel inside the now empty security office. To the outside world, everything was quiet. The thieves were ghosts in the machine. For a few moments they did nothing. They just stood there, in the heart of a silent palace, surrounded by the life's work of the world's greatest artists. What must that have felt like? The sheer audacity of it, the weight of the history in those rooms. But they didn't have time for contemplation. The clock was ticking. They had a shopping list. Their first stop was the Dutch room on the second floor. This was the crown jewel of Isabella's collection, a dark, wood-paneled gallery that felt more like a sacred chamber than a museum room. It housed a collection of masterpieces that would make the director of the Louvre weep with envy. And it was here, in the Dutch room, that the thieves would commit their most devastating acts of vandalism. They walked straight to the left wall. Hanging there was a painting that was pure chaos and terror, a masterpiece of biblical drama. It was Rembrandt's The Storm on the Sea of Galilee. This wasn't just a Rembrandt. It was his only known seascape. Imagine it. A tiny fishing boat caught in a violent squall. The waves are monstrous, black and green, crashing over the bow. The mast is snapping, the sail is torn to shreds. The disciples are in a panic. Some are wrestling with the rigging, one is vomiting over the side. And in the middle of it all, a single point of light. Jesus calmly waking from his sleep. It was a painting you didn't just look at, you felt it. You could almost feel the sea spray on your face and hear the roar of the wind. It was a priceless testament to the power of nature and faith. The thieves didn't care. They took a blade, sliced the canvas right out of its frame, and ripped it from its stretcher. The sound of that knife slicing through 350-year-old canvas must have been the only sound in the silent room. A brutal, sickening tear. They rolled it up, unceremoniously like a cheap poster. And just like that, a masterpiece that had survived centuries was gone. The empty frame was left hanging on the wall, a hollow ghost, a testament to the violence that had just occurred. But they weren't done with Rembrandt. A few feet away hung another of his works, A Lady and Gentleman in Black. It was a much quieter, more contemplative piece. A stark, elegant portrait of a wealthy Dutch couple, their faces rendered with that signature Rembrandt empathy that seemed to capture their very souls. Again, the thieves didn't bother with the delicate work of removing it properly. They smashed the glass, took a blade to the canvas, and tore it away. 2 Rembrandts gone in a matter of minutes. Then they turned their attention to the most valuable object in the entire room. Perhaps the most valuable stolen object in human history. It was a small, quiet painting by an artist so rare, so mythic, that his name is spoken in hushed tones, Johannes Vermeer. The painting was called The Concert. Vermeer is a legend. He produced very few paintings in his lifetime, and today only about 34 are known to exist. To own a Vermeer is to own something rarer than the most flawless diamond. And The Concert was a perfect example of his genius. It depicts 2 women and a man playing music in a sun-drenched room. A woman at a harpsichord, her back to the viewer, a man playing a lute, and another woman singing. The light pouring in from the window on the left is practically a holy presence in the room. It's a moment of perfect, tranquil harmony, frozen in time for over 300 years. Art historians believe it is the single most valuable unrecovered stolen painting in the world, with a modern-day value estimated at over $250 million. The thieves simply lifted it off the wall. Unlike the Rembrandts, it was painted on wood panel so they couldn't cut it. They just took it. The empty space they left on that wall is considered by many to be the most painful void in the entire art world. But their choices from here got strange. They weren't just targeting the most famous pieces. Next to the space where the Vermeer once hung was a painting titled Landscape with an Obelisk. For centuries, everyone believed it was another Rembrandt. But by 1990, art historians had reattributed it to his student, Govert Flinck. It was still a valuable 17th century Dutch masterpiece, but it wasn't a Rembrandt. Did the thieves know this? Were they art experts who knew its true worth? Or were they just grabbing what they thought was another big-name painting? This single choice has fueled decades of debate. Were they sophisticated connoisseurs or just clumsy thugs working off a list? They sliced this one out of its frame too. 5 masterpieces gone from one room. The carnage was breathtaking. The empty frames left hanging on the walls were a deliberate, taunting message. It wasn't just a theft, it was a desecration. They weren't just stealing art. They were murdering it, cutting its heart out and leaving the broken body behind for everyone to see. The scale of the loss from this one room is almost impossible to comprehend. Imagine walking into a room and finding a ghost. Not a person, but the ghost of a culture. The ghost of Rembrandt's Fury on the Sea of Galilee. The ghost of Vermeer's perfect, silent harmony. That's what the thieves left behind. An echo. A wound in the wall where a masterpiece used to be. With their bags now full of some of the most important paintings in Western art, you'd think they'd be done. They had secured a haul worth hundreds of millions of dollars. The logical move would be to get out, disappear into the night before their luck ran out. But they didn't. They weren't even close to being finished. They left the Dutch room, a scene of cultural carnage, and walked down the hall, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous museum. Their next target would be even more bizarre, raising more questions than answers, and proving that this was no ordinary robbery. This was something else entirely. They left the Dutch room, a chamber of ghosts, its walls now scarred with empty frames and dangling wires. The two men, still disguised as police officers, moved with a calm, unhurried purpose. They weren't rushing. They weren't panicked. They had the entire museum to themselves, a silent palace of treasures, and they were taking their time. They crossed the grand, tiled expanse of the first-floor corridor, their heavy boots the only sound in the dead of night, and ascended the main staircase to the second floor. They bypassed the magnificent tapestry room, a hall filled with priceless, wall-sized woven masterpieces, and ignored the Raphael room, home to some of the collection's most revered Italian Renaissance works. Instead, they turned into a smaller, more intimate space. The short gallery. It was a long, narrow room, almost a corridor, connecting the Dutch room to the little salon. It was filled with an eclectic mix of wonders. Glass cases held delicate artifacts, and the walls were a mosaic of smaller paintings and drawings. It was here, in this quiet connecting gallery, that the heist took its first truly bizarre turn. The attack on the Dutch room was brutal, a clear smash and grab for the most famous works. But what they did here, it made no sense. Their first target wasn't a painting at all. It was a gilded bronze eagle, a finial perched atop a silk flag from Napoleon Bonaparte's Imperial Guard. It was a beautiful object, a symbol of French military might, gleaming under the low light. One of the men simply walked over to the display, unscrewed the eagle from its pole, and tucked it away. The flag itself, a historic relic of immense value, they tried to take as well. They fumbled with the screws holding its case to the wall, but they were too tight, or they didn't have the right tool. So they just gave up. They abandoned a priceless Napoleonic battle flag because of a few stubborn screws. Think about that. These men had flawlessly bypassed a sophisticated security system, subdued 2 guards, and gained total control of a $500 million collection. Yet they were thwarted by basic hardware. This wasn't the work of a slick, professional crew. Or was it? Was this a deliberate misdirection? A piece of theater for anyone who might later analyze their movements? Ignoring the flag, they turned their attention to a nearby glass cabinet. Inside sat a small, unassuming bronze beaker, an ancient Chinese vessel known as a ku. It dated back to the Shang dynasty, over 3,000 years old. Its historical significance was immense, but its monetary value was a tiny fraction of the masterpieces hanging just a few feet away. Without hesitation, they took it. An ancient Chinese ceremonial cup and a Napoleonic eagle. What was the plan here? What kind of collection were they building? The items had no connection to each other, culturally, historically, or financially. It was like someone was running through a museum with a shopping list written in a dozen different languages. Then they went back to the walls. They approached a series of 5 small frame drawings. They were works on paper by the French impressionist Edgar Degas. Sketches of horses and jockeys, quick, energetic captures of movement. They were valuable, certainly, but they were studies, not major works. The thieves worked quickly, popping the small frames off the wall. Easy to carry, easy to conceal. Perhaps that was the logic. They were grabbing what was portable. But that theory falls apart with their next choice. They moved to the opposite wall, to a painting that was the crown jewel of the short gallery, Chez Tortoni by Edouard Manet. It was the only painting by the celebrated artist in Isabella Stewart Gardner's entire collection. It depicts a well-dressed man in a top hat, sitting at a table in a famous Parisian cafe, a half-empty glass of beer before him. He's looking out, past the viewer, as if distracted by the bustling city life just outside the frame. In the background, you can see the hustle of the cafe reflected in a mirror. It's a masterpiece of modern life, a fleeting moment captured forever. Or so everyone thought. Unlike the Rembrandts, they didn't cut this one from the frame. They carefully, methodically removed the entire painting, frame and all. This was a much larger piece than the Degas sketches. It was a significant, recognizable work of art. And now it was gone. The empty space on the wall was a gaping wound. So let's recap their haul from the short gallery. A French eagle, an ancient Chinese beaker, 5 small French sketches, and 1 major French painting. It's a baffling assortment. But the real mystery of the short gallery isn't what they took. It's what they left behind. In that very same room, hanging just feet away from where they worked, was a Raphael, the Count Tommaso in Gurami, a world-famous portrait by one of the 3 giants of the Italian High Renaissance. It's considered one of the finest portraits of its time, valued in the tens if not hundreds of millions of dollars. They didn't touch it. They also left a Botticelli and a Fra Angelico. They walked past Renaissance titans to steal sketches and a bronze cup. Why? The question hangs in the air, thick and heavy as the silence in the looted gallery. Were they ignorant? Did they genuinely not know the value of what they were looking at? Seems impossible. Anyone with a passing knowledge of art, let alone someone entrusted to steal $500 million worth, would know the name Raphael. Were they working from a specific and very strange shopping list provided by a mysterious buyer with eclectic tastes? Or were they constrained by something else? Time? The size of the works? It doesn't add up. They took the framed Manet, which wasn't small, but left the Raphael, which was of a similar size. The entire episode in the short gallery defies logic. It shatters the image of a clean, professional heist and replaces it with a portrait of chaos, confusion, and deeply personal, unknowable motives. Having assembled their bizarre collection of loot, the two men did something else that makes security experts scratch their heads to this day. They backtracked. Instead of moving forward, deeper into the museum, they turned around and went back to the scene of their first crime. The Dutch room. Why go back? It's a tactical error. You never return to a compromised area. You move forward, you get what you came for, and you get out. Returning to the Dutch room increased their time in the museum, increased their risk of being discovered, and served no obvious purpose. The major prizes were already on the floor, cut from their frames. What could they possibly have forgotten? They walked back into the darkened chamber, past the empty frames of the Rembrandts and the Vermeer. They stepped over the debris on the floor, and they approached a wall with smaller works. Their target this time was almost comically small. It was a self-portrait by Rembrandt, but it wasn't a painting. It was an etching, a print on a tiny piece of paper no bigger than a credit card. Created when he was just 23 years old, it shows the young artist in a moment of surprise, his eyes wide, his mouth agape. It's an intimate, powerful little image, a glimpse into the soul of a genius. One of the thieves simply popped the tiny frame off the wall. It was the smallest and by far the least valuable piece they would steal all night. Why? Why return to a room they had already decimated, risking everything, for a postage stamp-sized etching? Was it an afterthought? Or was this tiny personal portrait the whole point? Some investigators believe this piece, more than any other, holds the key. The other works were trophies, assets. But this tiny etching felt personal. A collector's piece. A signature. The men now had their arms full. A Napoleonic eagle, a Chinese coup, 5 Degas sketches, the Manet, and now a tiny Rembrandt self-portrait. They had been inside the Gardner for well over an hour. They had violated 2 of the museum's most important galleries. They had shown meticulous planning and baffling incompetence, all in the same night. And they still weren't finished. They turned away from the Dutch room for the final time, leaving its desecrated walls behind them. They had one more stop to make, a move that would take them downstairs, and lead to an act of vandalism so pointless, so needlessly destructive, it adds the final confounding layer to the greatest art mystery of all time. With their bags now impossibly heavy, laden with a king's ransom in canvas and pigment, the 2 thieves turned their backs on the Dutch room. They left behind a scene of calculated desecration. Empty frames hung on the walls like open wounds, their gilded edges surrounding nothing but bare damask. The ghosts of Rembrandt, Vermeer, and Flink now haunted the space they had occupied for nearly a century. The thieves moved with a new sense of urgency, their footsteps echoing in the cavernous silence of the palace. They descended the main staircase, passing by priceless tapestries and Roman sarcophagi, ignoring masterpieces that other, lesser criminals would have killed for. Their mission, it seemed, was complete. They had the Vermeer. They had the Rembrandts. They had everything an art thief could ever dream of. The logical next step was the exit. Melt back into the pre-dawn darkness of Boston, disappear with their $500 million haul, and become legends. But they didn't go to the exit. Instead, they took a baffling detour. On the ground floor, they entered a space known as the Short Gallery. It was a long, narrow room connecting the Dutch room to the Titian room, lined with paintings, furniture, and display cases. It was here, in this seemingly random hallway, that the thieves performed their most perplexing act of the entire night. Their target wasn't a painting. It wasn't a sculpture. It was a flagpole, or rather something attached to it. In the corner of the room stood a silk flag of the 1st Regiment of Imperial Guard of Napoleon Bonaparte. It was an impressive artifact, but what drew the thieves' attention was the object perched on top of the pole, a bronze eagle finial. A beautifully cast, gilded bird of prey, wings slightly spread, talons clutching a thunderbolt. It was the symbol of Napoleon's all-conquering army, a relic from the battlefields of 19th-century Europe. Compared to the Vermeer in their bag, its monetary value was trivial, maybe a few $1,000s, 10,000 on a good day. It was a historical curiosity, not a masterpiece. And yet, one of the thieves meticulously, carefully, began to unscrew it from the pole. This wasn't a smash and grab. He didn't break the glass of a case. He took the time to deliberately detach this single specific object. Why? Why risk precious seconds with the clock ticking towards the shift change for a glorified paperweight? It was a move that defied all logic. They had just pulled off the most audacious art heist in history, demonstrating a sophisticated knowledge of their primary targets, and now they were fixated on a piece of military memorabilia. Their strange obsession didn't stop with the eagle. After securing the finial, they turned their attention to the flag itself. They tried to wrench the entire flagpole from its stand to take the whole thing. But the pole was bolted into a heavy base, secured within a frame. They pulled. They twisted. It wouldn't budge. Frustrated, they gave up. This moment of clumsy, almost comical failure stands in stark contrast to the surgical precision they displayed upstairs. They could slice a Rembrandt from its frame with a surgeon's hand, but they couldn't steal a flag. This single act, the theft of the finial and the failed attempt on the flag, has tormented investigators for decades. It's the nagging detail that doesn't fit, the piece of the puzzle that seems to come from a different box entirely. It blows a hole in the simplest theory, which is that this was a straightforward robbery for profit. If money was the only motive, you would ignore the finial and grab one of the 5 Degas drawings they just walked right past, each worth exponentially more. So what does it mean? One theory is that this was a bespoke heist, a shopping list job commissioned by an eccentric collector with a very specific set of tastes. A collector who wanted not just the art, but this specific symbol of Napoleonic power. The finial in this scenario could have acted as a kind of proof of theft, an obscure item that only the true thieves would have, a way to verify their identity to a shadowy buyer without revealing the more valuable pieces. But there's a darker, more politically charged theory. A theory that points across the Atlantic, to the long and bloody conflict in Northern Ireland. The eagle finial wasn't just any military symbol. It was the emblem of an army that famously fought the British. For certain groups, particularly the Irish Republican Army, or IRA, an object like this would be dripping with symbolic power. It was a trophy of defiance against a historical enemy. The IRA had a known history of art theft, using stolen masterpieces as collateral, as bargaining chips to trade for the release of imprisoned members, or simply to fund their operations. Could the Gardner heist have been an IRA job? Was the finial a personal trophy for a commander, a symbol of their own fight? It would explain the bizarre choice. It was never about the money, it was about the message. Or perhaps the answer is far simpler, and in a way far more disturbing. Maybe one of the thieves just liked it. Maybe in the middle of this high-stakes, hyper-focused crime, one of them had a moment of pure, impulsive desire. He saw the eagle, a symbol of strength and victory, and decided he had to have it for himself. A personal trophy to commemorate the night he conquered the Gardner. This suggests a different kind of criminal. Not a cold, calculating professional, but a brazen cowboy, driven by ego as much as greed. It would mean the entire heist, for all its planning, was susceptible to the whims of the men carrying it out. Whatever the reason, with the bronze eagle now in their possession, their strange shopping trip was finally over. They had one last, crucial task to perform. They left the short gallery and headed down into the museum's basement. This was the nerve center of the Gardner's security. Here they found the office of the director of security, and inside that office, the videocassette recorder that captured all the footage from the museum's cameras. They didn't just smash the machine. They were more thorough than that. They systematically ejected the tape from the VCR, the tape that recorded their every move, from the moment they buzzed at the door to their final descent into the basement. Then they went further. They found the printout from the security system's motion detectors. It was a dot matrix paper trail, logging every time a sensor was tripped in the museum that night. It was a minute-by-minute diary of their crime. They took that too. And then they did something else that continues to baffle investigators. They didn't just take the tape from the night of the heist. They also located and stole the tape from the previous 24-hour cycle. They took the tape from the day before the robbery. Why? The prevailing theory is that one or both of the thieves had cased the museum the day before, perhaps dressed as a tourist, walking the halls, timing the guard patrols, getting the lay of the land. Taking that tape would erase any evidence of their reconnaissance. It was a professional, paranoid, and incredibly smart move. It suggests that while their taste in loot may have been erratic, their understanding of evidence was anything but. With the tapes and the printouts in hand, they had effectively erased themselves. They had cut the eyes and ears out of the museum's security system. Now all that was left was to leave. They made one final trip back to the security desk where the two guards, Rick Bath and the other guard, were still bound and gagged. They reportedly asked them one last time if they were comfortable, a final chilling act of mock courtesy. Then they walked out the same side door they had entered through 81 minutes earlier. They loaded their priceless haul into their vehicle, and under the cover of a freezing St. Patrick's Day night, they vanished. The crime was complete. Inside the stone walls of the palace, two guards were tied up in the basement, helpless. Hundreds of millions of dollars in art was gone. The empty frames on the walls stood silent vigil in the dark. And as the first hint of gray light touched the Boston skyline, the city slept on, completely unaware that 13 of its greatest treasures had just been stolen, leaving behind a silence that would soon turn into a global scream. The first sign that something was wrong wasn't a siren or a shout, but a key that wouldn't turn. The morning relief guards arrived just after 8 a.m., ready to take over from the night shift. But the employee entrance, a heavy steel door, was locked. That was unusual. They called out, "Silence!" They radioed, "More silence!" A growing unease settled in the crisp March air. Finally, after getting no response, they called for backup and forced their way inside. What they found was a scene of eerie, unnatural calm. The museum was quiet, but it was a dead quiet. A wrong quiet. They followed the silence down to the basement, to the security office. And there they were. Rick Bath and the second guard, bound head to toe in duct tape, helpless in their chairs. When the tape was finally cut from their mouths, the first words tumbled out, breathless and panicked, painting a picture of a crime so audacious, so impossible, it sounded like a fever dream. The call went out. First to the museum's head of security, then to its director, and Holly. She was at home just starting her day when the phone rang. The voice on the other end was frantic, the words barely coherent. "We've been robbed." Holly's first thought was that maybe the gift shop had been hit. A few $1,000s in merchandise, a broken window, an annoyance. But the voice on the other end corrected her, the words landing like body blows. "No. The galleries. They took the Vermeer." In that moment, the world tilted on its axis. The Vermeer. The concert. One of only 34 known paintings by Johannes Vermeer in the entire world. It was the heart of the Gardner collection. The idea of it being gone was like being told the sun had been stolen from the sky. Holly rushed to the museum, her mind racing, a cold dread creeping into her veins. But nothing could have prepared her for what she saw. By the time she arrived, the museum was swarming with Boston police and soon the FBI. The scene inside the Dutch room was a desecration. It was a gallery of ghosts. On the floor, leaning against a cabinet, was the massive, ornate frame that once held Rembrandt's masterpiece, The Storm on the Sea of Galilee. It was empty. The canvas, Rembrandt's only known seascape, had been crudely sliced out, the jagged edges of the remaining fabric a testament to the brutal haste of the thieves. Nearby, another empty frame, this one for a lady and gentleman in black, also by Rembrandt. Cut out. Gone. And then, the space on the wall where Vermeer's The Concert used to hang. An empty rectangle of faded wallpaper. A wound in the wall. The silence in that room was deafening. It was the sound of $500 million in art vanishing into thin air. The thieves hadn't just stolen paintings, they had stolen pieces of history, fragments of the human soul committed to canvas. Investigators fanned out, documenting the carnage. In the short gallery, a small Rembrandt self-portrait etching, no bigger than a postage stamp, had been taken. A 5,000-year-old Chinese bronze beaker, a gu, was missing from a tabletop. And in one of the most bizarre details of the entire crime, a bronze eagle finial, ripped from the top of a Napoleonic flag, was also gone. The flag itself, a priceless silk relic, was left behind. The initial assessment was baffling. The thieves had taken 13 pieces, with a combined value that was almost impossible to calculate. But the choices were strange. They had left behind the museum's most valuable single painting, Titian's The Rape of Europa. They had ignored works by Raphael, Botticelli, and Michelangelo, pieces any art thief would kill for. Instead, they took a Flink, a Manet, and that strange eagle finial. It was like watching a bank robber steal a handful of 20s, but leave a pallet of gold bars sitting on the floor. As the FBI began to process the scene, they found more contradictions. The thieves had made a mess. They had smashed a display case. They'd left the empty frames on the floor. They'd cut the canvases with what looked like box cutters. This wasn't the work of sophisticated, stealthy art thieves. This was a smash and grab, a brute force attack. And yet, they had successfully bypassed the museum's security systems. They had controlled the guards, and they had vanished without a trace. No fingerprints, no fibers, no witnesses outside the museum. It was as if two ghosts had walked in, ransacked the place, and then simply dissolved into the night. The only real evidence they had was the testimony of the two guards. Rick Abath and his colleague recounted their 81-minute ordeal. They told investigators how the thieves, dressed as police officers, had been surprisingly calm, even reassuring. They told the guards not to worry, that they wouldn't be hurt. They'd asked if they were armed. They'd even commented on Abath's long hair. It was a strangely personal, almost casual interaction for such a high-stakes crime. But as the FBI listened to Rick Abath's story, a few details began to snag. Little things that didn't quite add up. Abath was the one who buzzed them in breaking protocol. Abath was the one who stepped out from behind the security desk, away from the silent alarm. And there was something else, something hidden in the museum's own data. The motion detectors. The Gardner was equipped with a system that printed out a log of every time a motion detector was triggered in the galleries. It was a simple, old-fashioned system, but it worked. It created a digital map of movement through the museum. And the printout from the night of the heist told a strange story. It showed the thieves moving through the Dutch room, the short gallery, the blue room, tracked their every step. But it also revealed something about Rick Abath. Abath had told the FBI that moments before the thieves arrived, he had been doing his rounds, passing through the galleries. But the motion detector log showed no activity in those areas at that time. The only movement they registered was Abath at the security desk, and then the thieves once they were inside. It was a small discrepancy, a detail that could be explained by a faulty sensor or a misremembered timeline. But in a case with zero leads, a small discrepancy is like a loose thread on a sweater. You start to pull on it just to see what might unravel. And there was one more thing. The fire alarm. The night before the heist, just after midnight, a fire alarm had gone off in the museum. Rick Abath had been on duty. He'd gone through the procedure, shutting it down and resetting the system. It was chalked up to a glitch. But now, in the chilling light of the morning after, investigators had to wonder, was it a glitch? Or was it a test run? A way for someone to see how long it took for the fire department to respond? A way for an inside man to get comfortable with the system he was about to help someone bypass? The investigation had just begun, but already the focus was starting to shift. The search for two phantom police officers was still priority one. But a second, quieter investigation was opening up. One that didn't look out into the criminal underworld of Boston, but looked inward. It looked at the long-haired, 23-year-old night watchman who loved his rock band more than his security job. It looked at the one man who held the keys to the kingdom, the one man who opened the door and let the monsters in. The question was no longer just who stole the art, but was he a victim or was he the architect? Rick Abath, 23 years old, a college dropout playing guitar in a local rock band called Uzi. He was, by all accounts, more interested in getting high and playing gigs than he was in protecting $1 billion worth of art. He'd shown up to work stoned before. He'd been known to let friends into the museum after hours for a private tour. He was a night owl, a musician, a slacker, the antithesis of a disciplined security guard. To some, this painted the picture of a perfect, unwitting pawn. To the FBI, it looked like the perfect cover. Let's go back to that moment. 1:24 a.m. on March 18, 1990. Two men dressed as Boston police officers are on the intercom. Abath sees them on the security monitor. The rulebook was crystal clear, drilled into every guard. You do not open the doors for anyone after hours, no exceptions. Not for police, not for firemen, not even for the museum director. The protocol was to call the head of security, who would then call the police to verify. Abath did none of this. He buzzed them in. His explanation? They looked official. They told him they were responding to a disturbance. He was young, he panicked, he thought he was doing the right thing. But this was post-St. Patrick's Day in Boston. The streets were filled with revelers. A disturbance call wasn't unusual. And yet, he broke the single most important rule of his job. This was the first domino to fall. The one decision that set everything in motion. Once inside, the fake cops told Abath he looked familiar, that they had a warrant out for his arrest, and ordered him to step away from the security desk. This was a brilliant move. It immediately put Abath on the defensive and, crucially, separated him from the only link to the outside world, the panic button. He complied. They handcuffed him, and according to Abath, they wrapped duct tape around his head, covering his eyes and mouth. They did the same to the second guard, who was just returning from his rounds. Then they led them both down to the basement, chaining them to pipes on opposite ends of the room, 40 yards apart. For the next 81 minutes, the thieves had the run of the place. But here's where Rick Abath's story starts to unravel. When the police arrived the next morning, they found him and the other guard in the basement. But they didn't find them tightly bound. In fact, the tape was on the floor. Abath claimed he'd managed to wriggle free after the thieves left. But the more investigators pressed him, the more his story seemed off. The way he described being taped up sounded almost physically impossible to escape from. Then came the motion detector data. This was the ghost in the machine, the silent witness that recorded every footstep. The museum system printed out a log of every time a motion detector was triggered in a specific room. The FBI pored over these printouts, and they found something that made the hair on their arms stand up. The records showed that after the thieves had supposedly taken Abath to the basement, there was still movement detected behind the security desk where he had been stationed. Someone was there. Who was it? The thieves had already moved on to the galleries. The other guard was on his rounds. It left only one possibility. But the most damning piece of evidence came from just a few hours before the robbery. The side door, the one the thieves used to load the getaway vehicle, had been opened and closed briefly around midnight. When questioned, Abath admitted he did it. He said he was just testing the door, making sure it was secure. But why then? It was a breach of protocol. To investigators, it looked less like a routine check and more like a signal. A quick open and shut to let the thieves know the coast was clear, that he was the man on the inside. The FBI was convinced he was involved. They hauled him in for questioning again and again. They put him on a polygraph, a lie detector test. And according to FBI reports, he failed miserably. The needles jumped when they asked if he knew who the robbers were. They spiked when they asked if he had helped plan the heist. In the eyes of law enforcement, this was as good as a confession. But a polygraph isn't proof. It's a tool, an often unreliable one. And it's not admissible in court. They had a mountain of circumstantial evidence, a pile of red flags, but nothing concrete. No confession, no money trail, no physical evidence linking him directly to the crime. Abath, for his part, has always maintained his innocence. He paints a picture not of a criminal mastermind, but of a naive kid who made a terrible mistake. He argues that his entire life was turned upside down. He lost his job, his band broke up, he was hounded by the media and the FBI for years. He claims he was a victim just like the museum. He says he was just a stoner who got in over his head, a guy who wanted to be a rock star, not a getaway driver. His defenders argue that his inconsistencies were the result of a traumatic event, the fog of fear and memory, not the lies of a co-conspirator. Why would a man who helped steal $500 million in art end up living in a small apartment in Vermont, struggling to make ends meet? The money never surfaced, and neither did any evidence that Abath ever saw a dime of it. So which is it? Was he the bumbling night watchman, the unluckiest security guard in history? Or was his slacker persona the perfect camouflage for the inside man? Think about it. The thieves knew exactly which guard was on duty. They knew his partner would be on his rounds, leaving Abath alone at the desk. They knew to separate him from the panic button. They knew the location of the DVR that recorded the security footage so they could steal the tapes. They knew precisely which paintings to take and, more importantly, which ones to leave. This wasn't a smash and grab. This was a surgical strike, executed with an impossible level of inside knowledge. Knowledge that someone like Rick Abath had at his fingertips. He was the gatekeeper. Whether he knew it or not, he held the keys. For years, the investigation circled him. A vortex of suspicion with Abath at its calm, unprovable center. The FBI believed he was scared. Scared of the men he let in that night. Scared of what they would do if he talked. They were certain he wasn't the mastermind, but a small, critical cog in a much larger machine. A machine run by people far more dangerous than a 23-year-old guitarist. Investigators started digging into Abath's life outside the museum, into the bars he frequented, the people he knew. And that's when they found a potential link. A loose thread connecting the slacker security guard to the organized crime families that ran Boston's North End. A local hoodlum, a low-level enforcer for the Patriarcha crime family, had recently been fired from his job at the museum. His name was Louis Royce. And just a few weeks before the heist, Royce had given a private, after-hours tour of the museum to a man named David Houghton. Houghton was a small-time thief, an associate of a notorious Boston gangster named Carmelo Merlino. Suddenly, the circle was widening. The case was no longer just about a guard and two fake cops. It was spiraling outwards, into the dark, violent heart of the Boston mob. The question was no longer just about what Rick Abath did, but who he knew, and who he was afraid of. And the people Rick Abath was afraid of were not your average criminals. They weren't petty thieves or common burglars. To understand who the FBI believed was truly behind the Gardner heist, you have to understand Boston in 1990. It was a city caught in the grip of a dying dynasty. The Patriarcha crime family, the dominant force in New England's underworld for decades, was tearing itself apart. An internal war was raging, creating a power vacuum filled with ambitious, violent, and reckless men. And in Dorchester, a gritty neighborhood of Boston, there was a greasy, nondescript auto repair shop, TRC Auto Electric. From the outside, it was just another garage, but on the inside, it was the headquarters for a crew of mobsters run by a man named Carmelo Merlino. Merlino wasn't a top-level boss, but he was a seasoned, respected figure in the local mob scene. And his auto shop wasn't just for fixing cars. It was a place where deals were made, debts were settled, and crimes were planned. It was a clubhouse for killers, drug dealers, and thieves. And according to the FBI's strongest theory, it was the place where the biggest art heist in history was born. The investigators started looking back at Rick Abath. They looked at his life outside the museum, the bars he went to, the circles he ran in. And while there was no direct, provable link, the whispers were there. Abath, the wannabe rock star, the guy who partied a little too hard, frequented spots on the peripheries of this world. It's not hard to imagine a scenario. Maybe he owed a debt. Maybe he bragged about the museum's lax security one night to the wrong person. Or maybe he was just a convenient tool, a known quantity who could be easily intimidated or bribed into leaving a side door open. The FBI believed Abath wasn't the mastermind. He was the key. And Carmelo Merlino's crew were the ones who turned it. As the FBI dug into Merlino and his associates, a rogues gallery of career criminals began to emerge from the shadows. First, there was David Houghton, a low-level hoodlum, known for his big mouth. Shortly after the heist, Houghton started flashing cash and, more importantly, started talking. He allegedly told friends that he'd been to a warehouse to see the stolen art, and even claimed to have a piece of the bronze eagle finial that was ripped from the top of the Napoleonic flag. But Houghton's bragging was cut short. In 1991, he was found dead in his car. The official cause of death was a heart attack, but the timing was so perfect, so convenient, that investigators have always considered it suspicious. Then there was George Reisfelder, a big, intimidating guy with a long rap sheet. He was a known associate of the Merlino crew and, crucially, he bore a striking resemblance to the police sketch of one of the fake cops, the one with the mustache. Reisfelder also had a potential motive. He was facing a cocaine trafficking charge that could have put him away for a very long time. Perhaps the art was his ticket to a deal. But like Houghton, Reisfelder wouldn't be talking. He died of a drug overdose in 1991. Another convenient end. And then there was Bobby Donati, a tough, connected mobster with a reputation. The FBI believes Donati was one of the central figures in planning the heist. And not long after the robbery, he was seen with a Boston police uniform in the trunk of his car. In September 1991, a year and a half after the Gardner was hit, Bobby Donati's luck ran out. He was ambushed outside his home, stabbed over 20 times, and his throat was slit from ear to ear. His body was found in the trunk of his Cadillac. A classic brutal gangland slang pattern was emerging. A trail of bodies. People connected to the Merlino crew, people who might have known something about the heist, were ending up dead. This wasn't a sophisticated cat-and-mouse game between art thieves and detectives. This was the mob cleaning house. The FBI's theory solidified around a single powerful motive. It wasn't about the money. Fencing a stolen Vermeer is next to impossible. It was about leverage. At the time of the heist, a major federal indictment was coming down on the entire leadership of the Patriarca family, including a powerful capo named Vincent Ferrara, who was a close associate of Carmelo Merlino's crew. The theory goes that the heist was orchestrated to get a bargaining chip, a get-out-of-jail-free card. The plan was simple: steal hundreds of millions of dollars worth of priceless art, and then use it to negotiate Ferrara's freedom. Suddenly, the strange choice of stolen items made a chilling kind of sense. The thieves didn't take the most valuable painting in the museum, Titian's Rape of Europa. Why? Because it was huge. It was impractical. They took what was manageable, what was famous, what had a staggering price tag attached to it. They weren't art lovers. They were gangsters taking inventory. They saw a Rembrandt not as a masterpiece of light and shadow, but as an asset worth a certain number of years off a prison sentence. They saw the Vermeer not as a priceless moment of quiet beauty, but as a key to a cell door. The FBI was now convinced. They had the who, the Merlino crew. They had the why, leverage for their boss. They had the how, an inside man in Rick Bath. They put the TRC auto shop under intense surveillance. They planted bugs, they listened to wiretaps, they squeezed informants. They heard Carmelo Merlino and his men talking about the paintings, joking about the heist, discussing how they might return the art in exchange for the $1 million reward and leniency for their friends. They were so close. They could practically smell the linseed oil and dried canvas. But they never heard the one thing they needed: a direct confession. They never heard anyone say, "I did it." They never heard anyone say, "The art is buried in my backyard." The mobsters spoke in code, in whispers, in half-truths. They danced around the subject, fully aware they were likely being listened to. The FBI had a mountain of circumstantial evidence, a compelling narrative, and a trail of dead bodies. But they had no physical proof, no fingerprints, no DNA, and most importantly, no art. The investigation was hitting a wall. The men who might have known the most were all dead, and the ones who were still alive were hardened, old-school mobsters who lived and died by the code of silence. One man, in particular, became the FBI's new focus. A terrifying figure within the Merlino crew named Robert Guarenta, known as the Cook. Guarenta was a convicted bank robber, a drug trafficker, and a suspected murderer. He was a man with cold eyes and a reputation for violence that made even other mobsters nervous. Informants told the FBI that after the heist, Bobby Donati, before he was murdered, had given 2 of the paintings to Robert Guarenta for safekeeping. The trail had led from a bumbling night watchman, through a greasy auto shop, past a string of dead bodies, and now it pointed directly at one of the most dangerous men in the Boston underworld. The FBI believed Robert Guarenta had possession of, or at the very least knew the location of, $500 million worth of stolen masterpieces. But getting it from him wouldn't be easy. You don't just walk up to a man like the Cook and ask him for a stolen Rembrandt. He was a ghost, a professional who knew how to stay in the shadows. And as the years ticked by, he took whatever secrets he had with him into old age and sickness. In 2004, Robert Guarenta died of cancer, still a free man. It seemed, for all the world, that the last best link to the stolen art had just vanished from the earth. The trail had finally gone cold. The secrets buried forever with a killer. Except on his deathbed, Robert Guarenta did talk. He didn't talk to the FBI. He talked to his wife, and he told her exactly what he had done with the paintings. Eileen Guarenta told the FBI that her husband, on his deathbed, confessed that he hadn't destroyed the art. He hadn't buried it. He had given it to a trusted friend, a fellow mobster from Connecticut named Robert Gentile. The name landed like a bombshell inside the FBI's Boston field office. For the first time in years, they had a solid, actionable lead. A direct link from a major suspect, now deceased, to a living, breathing person who might just have 13 masterpieces stashed in his basement. So, who was Robert Gentile? On the surface, he was nobody. A cranky 70-something wise guy living a quiet life in a modest blue house in Manchester, Connecticut. He was a made man in the Philadelphia crime family, but his glory days, if he ever had them, were long behind him. He looked more like a retired grandfather than a key player in the biggest art heist in history. He was known to his friends as Bobby the Cook. He ran a used car lot, he had a bad back, and he complained a lot. He seemed completely harmless. But the FBI knew that in the world of the mob, appearances are everything. And Bobby Gentile, they suspected, was hiding a world-class secret. In 2010, armed with Eileen Guarente's testimony, federal agents descended on his home. They weren't just looking for the art, they were looking for anything that tied Gentile to the crime. And they found it. Not the paintings, but in his basement, they found a treasure trove of incriminating evidence. They found 2 full police uniforms just like the ones the thieves wore. They found police hats and badges. They found handcuffs. They found a police scanner program to the Boston police frequency. It was a perfect heist starter kit. And then they found the kicker. Tucked away was a copy of the Boston Herald newspaper from March 19, 1990, the day after the robbery. The headline in big, bold letters read, "Masterpiece Heist." When questioned, Gentile had an answer for everything. The uniforms? He just liked collecting them. The scanner? A hobby. The newspaper? He just saves old papers, what's the big deal? He played the part of the confused, crotchety old man perfectly. He admitted he was friends with Robert Guarente. He admitted Guarente had given him something to hold on to years ago, but he claimed he had no idea what it was. He was just doing a favor for a friend. The FBI wasn't buying it. They brought him in for a polygraph test. A lie detector. Now, polygraphs aren't admissible in court, but for investigators, they are a powerful tool to gauge truthfulness and apply pressure. They strapped Gentile in and started asking the questions that had haunted them for 2 decades. The results were stunning. According to the FBI's official report, Gentile failed, and he failed spectacularly. When asked if he had any of the stolen art, the test indicated deception. When asked if he knew where any of the stolen art was, the test indicated deception. When asked if he had ever possessed any of the stolen art, the needle practically jumped off the page. The polygraph examiner concluded there was a 99.9% probability that Robert Gentile was lying. He knew. The FBI was sure of it. This cranky old man from Connecticut was their man. He was the keeper of the secret. But they had a problem. The statute of limitations for the theft itself had expired years ago. They couldn't charge him with the heist. And without the paintings, all they had was circumstantial evidence and a failed polygraph test. So they did what the federal government does best. They squeezed. If they couldn't get him on the heist, they would get him on something else. Anything else. They started digging into every corner of Gentile's life. And it didn't take long to find leverage. They busted him for selling illegally obtained prescription painkillers. Then they hit him with a federal firearms charge. As a convicted felon, he wasn't allowed to own the guns they'd found in his house. The message was clear: talk or you will die in prison. They offered him deals. They offered him immunity. They offered him a reduced sentence. All he had to do was tell them where the paintings were. Gentile refused. He was old school. Omerta, the code of silence. He wasn't going to be a rat, even if it meant spending the rest of his life behind bars. The standoff was excruciating for the FBI. They were closer than they had ever been. They could almost smell the aging oil paint and cracking varnish. They were convinced the art was somewhere on Gentile's property. So in 2012, they went back to his little blue house in Manchester, this time with a search warrant that would let them tear the place apart. They brought in ground-penetrating radar. They dug up his entire backyard, searching for any signs of disturbed earth. They found nothing. They tore through the walls, the attic, the garage. Nothing. The agents were getting desperate. Felt like another dead end. And then in the corner of his basement workshop, an agent noticed something odd about the concrete floor. It looked different, newer. They brought in jackhammers and started breaking through the concrete. Beneath it, they found a false floor made of wood. And beneath the wood was a pit. A dry well about 8 feet deep dug into the earth. It was a secret hiding place, concealed beneath layers of concrete and wood. The agents held their breath. This was it. This had to be it. They lowered lights and cameras into the dark hole. It was empty. A wave of deflation hit the team. Another dead end. But as they were packing up, an agent sweeping the pit found something. It was a piece of paper folded up and covered in dirt. They carefully unfolded it. It was a handwritten list. On it were the names of all 13 stolen Gardner artworks, along with their estimated black market values. This was a smoking gun. Why would this random small-time mobster have a detailed price list of the stolen Gardner art, hidden in a secret pit under his basement? Gentile, of course, had an answer. He claimed his old associate, the now-deceased Carmelo Merlino, had given him the list years ago. He said Merlino was trying to figure out if Gentile knew where the art was, hoping to get a piece of the reward money for himself. It was a classic mob excuse. The other guy did it and he was trying to set me up. The FBI was now in an impossible position. They had their man. They had circumstantial evidence piling up to the ceiling. They had a failed polygraph. They had a secret pit with a list of the stolen goods. They were certain Robert Gentile was either the current guardian of the art or, at the very least, the last man to know its location. But he wouldn't break. He sat in his jail cell, a frail, sick old man, holding on to the biggest secret in the art world, and he wouldn't say a word. He was sentenced to 30 months on the gun charges. The clock was ticking. Gentile's health was failing. If he died, the secret would die with him. The FBI knew they were running out of time. They had tried everything: threats, deals, searches, polygraphs. Nothing worked. So they decided to play one last desperate card. They decided to send in a wolf in sheep's clothing. They found a fellow inmate, a convicted murderer, and they wired him for sound. His mission: befriend the old man, gain his trust, and get him to finally confess where he hid the $500 million haul. The plan was as simple as it was dangerous. The informant, a man with nothing to lose and a reduced sentence to gain, began to orbit Robert Gentile in the prison yard. He didn't rush it. He knew the old mobster would smell a rat a mile away, so he played the long game. Days turned into weeks. They'd share stories, complain about the food, talk about the old days on the streets of Boston and Hartford. The informant was a natural. He was charming, he was a good listener, and he was a killer, which in the strange calculus of prison life, gave him a certain credibility. Gentile, an old man in poor health, isolated and likely lonely, started to open up. The FBI listened, glued to the audio feed, as their informant slowly, carefully began to steer the conversation. He'd talk about legendary heists, about guys who made one big score and disappeared. And then he'd mention the Gardner. He'd talk about it with a kind of reverence, the white whale of all crimes. He'd ask Gentile, "Bobby, you were around then. You must have heard things. Who had the stones to pull that off?" And Gentile, he would just smile. A sly, knowing smile. He'd say things like, "You're talking about a myth, a ghost story." But he never flat out denied knowing anything. He danced around it. He played the wise old man who'd seen it all. The recordings were maddening. They were filled with hours of small talk, punctuated by these tantalizing cryptic hints. Gentile would talk about the paintings as if he knew them personally. He'd mention the one with the flag, referring to Child Hassan Shea Tortoni, and the little Dutch guy, a clear reference to the stolen Rembrandt self-portrait. He was talking in code, but it was a code the FBI was beginning to understand. In one chilling conversation, the informant pressed him, asking if the paintings were safe. Gentile allegedly replied, "They're safe. In a safe place." He bragged that the heat was on him, that the feds were crawling all over him, but they'd never find a thing. He even gave the informant advice. If you ever have something that valuable, you don't keep it anywhere near you. You give it to someone you trust, someone with no connection to you, and you let them hold it. He was describing the perfect crime, but was he describing his own? The FBI had him on tape talking about the paintings, hinting at their location, but he never once said the magic words, "I did it," or "I know where they are." It was circumstantial. It was smoke, but it wasn't fire. They needed more, so they decided to turn up the heat. They offered Gentile a deal. They told him, "Bobby, we know you're not well. We'll recommend a lighter sentence on your current gun charges. All you have to do is take a polygraph test about the Gardner heist. Pass it and we walk away. It was a gamble. For Gentile, it was a chance to clear his name and get out of jail sooner. For the FBI, it was a chance to finally break him. Gentile, confident in his ability to outsmart a machine, agreed. He was wheeled into a sterile room, his frail body hooked up to a series of wires. The examiner began with baseline questions. Is your name Robert Gentile? Are you in a federal prison? Then came the questions that mattered. The questions a multi-agency task force had been waiting over 2 decades to ask. Do you have any knowledge of the whereabouts of the paintings stolen from the Gardner Museum? The needle on the machine jumped. Did you ever have possession of any of the stolen Gardner paintings? The needle violently scratched across the paper. Do you know who was involved in the theft of the Gardner paintings? The machine lit up like a Christmas tree. According to the FBI, it was one of the most deceptive polygraph results their examiner had ever seen. They had him. They knew he was lying. But here's the infuriating truth about American law. A failed polygraph is not a confession. It's not admissible in court as evidence of guilt. All it did was confirm what the FBI already suspected. Robert Gentile was the key. Now they went after him with everything they had. They got a new warrant and descended on his Manchester, Connecticut home like a military operation. This was no polite knock on the door. They brought in ground-penetrating radar. They tore up the concrete floor of his garage. They ripped out walls. They dug up his entire backyard, searching for any sign of disturbed earth, any hiding place. In a shed out back, they found a secret. Under a false floor, they discovered a deep, dry well, a ditch. It was empty, but it was exactly the kind of place you would hide something priceless, something you needed to keep perfectly dry and hidden from the world. Inside the house, the search continued. Tucked away in a drawer, they found a copy of the Boston Herald newspaper. It was dated March 19, 1990, the day after the Gardner heist. The front page screamed with headlines about the world's biggest art theft. Why would a man for over 22 years keep that specific newspaper? Was it a souvenir? A trophy? And then they found the smoking gun. Or so they thought. It was a small, unassuming piece of paper. On it, in what appeared to be Gentile's handwriting, was a list. The list contained several of the stolen Gardner artworks, and next to each one, a number. Investigators quickly realized what they were looking at. It was a price list, a ledger of what the paintings might be worth on the black market. This wasn't just a trophy. This was business. Armed with the failed polygraph, the secret ditch, the newspaper, and now this handwritten list, the FBI went back to the one person who knew Gentile best. His wife, Eileen. For years, she had denied everything, protecting her husband with a wall of silence. But the wall was crumbling. Her husband was old, sick, and facing the rest of his life in prison. The agents laid out the evidence. They showed her the list. They told her about the polygraph. They pressed her, telling her this was her last chance to tell the truth. And finally, she broke. She told them a story that sent shockwaves through the investigation. She said that years earlier, sometime in the late 90s or early 2000s, she had seen her husband hand over at least 2 of the paintings to another mobster, a man named Robert Guarenta. She said Guarenta was a close friend and criminal associate of her husband. She remembered a meeting at a restaurant in Portland, Maine. She said her husband gave Guarenta a painting. She couldn't remember which one. But she also remembered another time, seeing Guarenta with the solid gold eagle finial that had been ripped from the top of the Napoleonic flag. Her description was perfect. This was it. A direct eyewitness account linking the stolen art from Robert Gentile to another specific individual. The chain of custody was no longer broken. The trail, which had been cold for decades, was suddenly blazing hot. The FBI had a new target, a new name. Robert Guarenta, also known as Bobby the Cook. They had to find him. They had to lean on him, flip him, and get him to tell them where he took the paintings. The entire investigation pivoted, focusing all its resources on this one man. There was just one catastrophic problem. Robert Guarenta had died of cancer in 2004. The lead, the most promising piece of information in 25 years, had led them straight to a cemetery. The man who held the key was gone. It was another dead end, another ghost. The frustration was unimaginable. It seemed the curse of the Gardner heist had struck again. But investigators know that even dead men can talk. They leave behind clues, and they leave behind secrets. And just before he died, Robert Guarenta had supposedly confided in the one person he trusted most in the world. The entire $500 million case, the fate of Rembrandt and Vermeer, now rested on a single desperate hope: finding the widow of a dead mobster and praying she knew where the bodies, or in this case the paintings, were buried. Eileen Guarenta was not your typical key witness. She was the 72-year-old widow of a man who had lived and died by the criminal code of silence. But her husband, Bobby Guarenta, was gone. And before he died of cancer in 2004, racked with pain and regret, he had confessed something to her. He told her that years ago, he had been in possession of some of the stolen Gardner paintings. According to Eileen, her husband didn't orchestrate the heist, but he had ended up with some of the loot. And just before he died, knowing he couldn't take them with him, he had passed 2 of the paintings to a trusted friend, another aging Connecticut mobster named Robert Gentile. This was it, the first truly credible lead in years. The FBI descended on Robert Gentile's modest home in Manchester, Connecticut. They tore the place apart. Gentile, a man in his mid-70s with a bad back and a worse temper, watched as they ripped up floorboards and searched his backyard. He swore he knew nothing. He claimed Eileen Guarenta was a liar, just a greedy widow trying to cash in on the multi-million-dollar reward. But in his basement, agents found a clue that made the hair on their arms stand up. It was a copy of the Boston Herald from March 19, 1990, the day after the heist. Tucked inside was a handwritten list of the stolen Gardner artworks, each with a dollar figure next to it, an estimate of its black market value. Gentile had an explanation for that too. He said he and Guarenta were just fantasizing, kicking around the idea of trying to track down the art themselves to claim the reward. It was just talk, he insisted. But the FBI wasn't buying it. They believed Gentile was the key. They squeezed him hard. They arrested him on unrelated gun and drug charges, hoping the threat of dying in prison would loosen his tongue. They put him in front of a polygraph machine. The test was a disaster for Gentile. The needles flew off the chart when he was asked 2 simple questions. Did you receive stolen paintings from Robert Guarenta? And do you know the current location of any of the paintings? The polygraph examiner concluded Gentile was lying, but still he refused to talk. He maintained his innocence, even as his health failed behind bars. He insisted he didn't know where the art was, that if he did, he would have cashed in on the reward himself long ago. Years went by. Gentile was in and out of prison, a stubborn old man holding on to his secrets. The FBI seemed to be at another dead end. But then, in 2016, another tip surfaced. A source claimed that back in the early 2000s, they had witnessed Gentile hand over a small, rectangular painting to someone in the parking lot of a Connecticut diner. The description was a tantalizing match for Rembrandt's tiny self-portrait etching, one of the smaller, but still priceless pieces stolen from the Gardner. The investigation roared back to life. Another source pointed agents to a patch of ground behind Gentile's house, where they believed the art might have been buried. The FBI brought in ground-penetrating radar. They dug. The world's media watched, holding its breath. And once again they found absolutely nothing. Robert Gentile died in 2021 at the age of 85. If he was the man who held the key to the world's greatest art mystery, he took that key to his grave. The trail that began with his name had gone cold. Felt like the last best chance had evaporated. So where does that leave us? For decades, the FBI has chased ghosts down 1,000 different rabbit holes. They've pursued theories 100 times more complex than the one involving Gentile. There was the theory that the art was stolen for the Irish Republican Army, the IRA. Boston was a hotbed of IRA support, and its most infamous gangster, Whitey Bulger, was a known gunrunner for the cause. The idea was that the paintings would be used as leverage, a bargaining chip to free IRA prisoners. But Bulger, a man who knew every secret in the Boston underworld, always denied any involvement. When he was finally captured, he told investigators, "The Gardner Museum, that wasn't our type of work." Then there's the most cinematic theory. The eccentric Dr. No-style billionaire collector. The idea that some fantastically wealthy and amoral art lover commissioned the heist to hang these masterpieces in a secret private gallery, to be viewed by them and them alone. It's a compelling narrative, but it defies logic. A secret that big, involving that many people, is almost impossible to keep for over 30 years. Greed, betrayal, or just a slip of the tongue would have exposed it by now. And what about the man who started it all? The night watchman, Rick Abath, the 23-year-old stoner who literally opened the door and let the thieves in. The FBI officially cleared him, believing he was simply a naive kid who was duped. But the cloud of suspicion never fully lifted. His story had inconsistencies. His actions that night were, at best, incompetent and at worst, deeply suspicious. Why did he open the door against all protocol? Why was he the only person on duty not tied up with duct tape? Why did the motion detectors show him walking around the museum with the thieves? He spent the rest of his life denying any role. A man haunted by a single night. Rick Abath died in 2018. Another potential link to the truth, gone forever. Today, if you walk through the Dutch room on the second floor of the Isabella Stewart Gardner Museum, you will see something that will stop you in your tracks. On the damask-covered walls where Rembrandt's The Storm on the Sea of Galilee and A Lady and Gentleman in Black once hung, there are two large empty frames. In the short gallery, another empty frame marks the spot where Vermeer's The Concert used to be. They are not there by accident. Isabella Stewart Gardner's will was ironclad. She stipulated that if any major part of her collection were ever to be permanently moved or sold, the entire museum, its contents, and its endowment were to be auctioned off in Paris, with the proceeds going to Harvard University. To honor her wish that the collection remain exactly as she left it, the museum's trustees chose to leave the frames empty. They hang there as ghostly placeholders. They are monuments to an unsolved crime, a constant, silent testament to what was lost. They are perhaps the most powerful exhibit in the entire museum, representing an absence that is more palpable than any presence. They are a question mark hanging on the wall. The case remains open. The U.S. Attorney for Massachusetts still has a prosecutor assigned to it full-time. The reward, which started at $1 million, was raised to $5 million, and is now a staggering $10 million. $10 million for any information that leads directly to the recovery of the art in good condition. The offer comes with a promise. If you are in possession of the art, you can return it and you will not be prosecuted. The statute of limitations on the theft itself ran out decades ago. The goal is no longer about justice. It's about recovery. It's not about putting anyone in jail. It's simply about bringing the art home. And yet, there's been nothing. Not a single credible claim. Not a single piece has ever surfaced on the black market. In a world where secrets have a shelf life, where someone always talks for money or revenge, the silence surrounding the Gardner heist is deafening. It is the most confounding part of the entire mystery. Are the paintings destroyed? Lost in a fire, damaged by water in a leaky basement, or intentionally dumped in a river by panicked thieves? It's a heartbreaking but plausible scenario. Or are they still out there, hidden away in a climate-controlled vault, waiting for the heat to die down? Even after 3 decades? Are they hanging on the wall of a suburban home, their owners oblivious to the $500 million secret in their living room? We are left with more questions than answers. We have the empty frames, the aging suspects who took their secrets to the grave, and the lingering, tantalizing possibility that somewhere out there, a masterpiece by Vermeer is gathering dust in an attic, or a Rembrandt is rolled up under a bed. The Gardner heist is more than just the biggest property theft in history. It's a story about the fragility of beauty, the audacity of crime, and the enduring power of a mystery that refuses to be solved. And until those empty frames are filled, it is a story that has no end.